Your great-grandmother could not answer this question. What do dogs and rabbits have in common? She wasn't confused, she wasn't slow, she thought about it carefully and gave what she believed was a perfectly reasonable answer. I've seen dogs hunt rabbits. A good dog will tree a rabbit in 3 minutes. The researcher tried again. Yes, but what do they have in common as animals? She said, I can't really say, you'd have to have studied them. You already know the answer. You've known it since you were a child. They're both mammals. They're both animals. They share a category. But she didn't think in categories. Not because she was unintelligent. She survived, farmed, raised children, managed a household with no running water and no margin for error. She was sharp in every way that mattered for her world. She just thought differently than you do. And when scientists started measuring how differently, they found something that nobody was prepared for.
Every single generation in every country where data existed had been scoring higher on IQ tests than the generation before them. Not slightly, not at the margins. The average person alive today would have been classified as a genius by the standards of 1900. The average person from 1900 would score on a modern IQ test somewhere in the range we now associate with intellectual disability. Which means your great-grandmother, the one who survived and farmed and raised children through things you and I will never face, would have failed a test that most 10-year-olds today pass easily. That should bother you, because either the tests are right and something genuinely extraordinary has happened to the human mind in a single century, or the tests are measuring something that isn't quite what we think intelligence is. It turns out both are true, and that's exactly the problem.
In 1984, a political scientist, not a psychologist, a political scientist, named James Flynn published a paper that sent the entire field of intelligence research into quiet crisis. He had done something embarrassingly simple. He collected old IQ test data that researchers kept locked in filing cabinets, data that was never published because nobody thought it was interesting, and he compared it to modern scores. The rise was so consistent and so large that the researchers who had been administering these tests for decades had been quietly recalibrating the scoring every few years, just to keep 100 meaning average. If they hadn't, half the population would now be testing as gifted. So they kept resetting the baseline and never talked about why. Flynn talked about why. 3 IQ points per decade, everywhere. The Netherlands gained 20 points in a single generation. Japan, Norway, Belgium, same pattern. A century of unbroken, universal rise in measured human intelligence. He called it a paradox because the people from 1900 clearly weren't intellectually disabled. They built cities and wrote literature and ran governments and fought wars with a strategic complexity that matched anything we do today. So what exactly was rising?
Flynn spent years trying to answer that, and what he found changed the way he understood the question entirely. The gains were not spread evenly across the test. They were concentrated almost entirely in one specific type of question, the kind with no words, no numbers, no knowledge required, just an abstract visual pattern with a missing piece. Which piece completes it? These are called matrix reasoning problems, and for decades, psychologists believed this type of question was the purest possible measure of raw intelligence, the type you couldn't practice, couldn't fake, couldn't culturally bias. Either you saw it or you didn't. And this, the supposedly purest measure of raw intelligence, was the parts skyrocketing. The parts measuring actual knowledge, vocabulary, arithmetic, the things you learn, had barely moved. So it wasn't that each generation knew more, they were reasoning differently. They had developed a specific type of thinking, abstract, hypothetical, category-based, that their grandparents had almost never been asked to use. That farmer who couldn't answer what dogs and rabbits had in common wasn't missing facts, she was missing a mental habit, the habit of stepping back from the concrete world and classifying it from above. Her thinking was locked to the real, to things you could touch and use and do. Yours isn't. You think in abstractions all day without noticing. Categories, systems, hypotheticals, counterfactuals. You wonder about things that don't exist yet. You imagine worlds that aren't yours. This kind of thinking would have seemed strange, maybe even pointless to most people who lived before the 20th century. Flynn believed this was genuinely a form of cognitive liberation, that for most of human history, most people were trapped inside the immediate and the concrete, and that whatever forced the shift towards abstract thinking had freed something in the human mind. He was right about that. He just didn't see what was coming next.
In 2006, researchers began noticing something new in the data. The scores had stopped rising. Norway peaked in 1995 and began falling. Denmark followed, then the UK, Germany, France, Australia. The long climb that had defined the entire 20th century had plateaued, and in many countries quietly reversed. This is called the negative Flynn effect, and unlike the rise, which had a dozen tidy explanations, the fall is genuinely uncomfortable to explain. Because nothing obvious had gone away. Nutrition was still improving, schools were still running, the world was more cognitively stimulating than ever. More information, more screens, more things demanding your attention and processing every hour of every day. And yet, something was falling. The leading theory, the one that keeps appearing in the research no matter how many times people try to explain it away, has to do with the type of thinking modern life selects for. Not intelligence, the type. Screens don't make you stupid, but the way most people use them trains a specific cognitive habit, fast, reactive, surface level, moving on before anything has fully landed. You are processing more information than any human being in history. You are sitting with less of it than almost any generation before you. Studies tracking the written vocabulary of teenagers over the past 70 years show a significant decline in the complexity of language used. And this matters more than it sounds, because vocabulary is not just how you communicate, it's how you think. The words you have available are the thoughts you're capable of forming. Lose the word for a distinction and you lose the ability to make it. A mind with 10,000 words has access to gradations and concepts a mind with 5,000 words simply cannot reach. The sentences are getting shorter. The ideas inside them are following.
Flynn died in 2020. Near the end of his life, people kept asking him whether he was worried. He said something that didn't fit neatly into either side of the debate. He said the rise in abstract thinking was real and valuable, and he believed in it. Being able to reason hypothetically, to think about what doesn't exist yet, to hold a contradiction and examine it, to imagine yourself into another person's situation, this was new in the broad sweep of human history. And it had political consequences. A population that can think abstractly is harder to manipulate, harder to lead by fear alone, harder to convince that the way things are is the only way they can be. But he also said that the thing abstract IQ scores could not replace was wisdom. Wisdom is not abstract. It is not a pattern on a matrix test. It is what happens when you have sat with hard things long enough to know the difference between what is true and what merely sounds true, between what matters in 10 years and what feels urgent today, between a real answer and a compelling one. And wisdom, he said, was not being measured, which meant it was not being valued, which meant it was not being built. The generation scoring highest on abstract reasoning has also, in study after study, shown the lowest tolerance for ambiguity, the weakest patience with complexity, the strongest pull toward content that tells you what to think rather than giving you the material to think for yourself. We got better at the puzzle. We got worse at living with the question.
So here is what that means for you. By one very real measure, you are smarter than your great-grandmother was. Your pattern recognition is faster. Your abstract reasoning is sharper. You would score higher on the test than anyone from her generation. And she may have had something you don't. Not because her brain was better, but because her world demanded a different kind of attention. Slower, more sustained, less distracted, the kind that turns something over for days without needing to resolve it, that builds understanding the way you build a wall, one piece resting on the last, nothing floating. You are not dumber than she was. You are optimized for a different problem. The question is whether the problem you're optimized for is the one that's actually in front of you. Flynn spent his entire career measuring what it means to be smart, and the thing he kept returning to, the thing he wrote about near the very end, wasn't any score or any skill. It was the decision to take your own thinking seriously, not just to feed your mind, not just to use it, but to build it, deliberately, slowly, the way you would build anything you expected to carry weight. Every generation has been smarter than the last. The question for yours is smarter at what? And is there enough?